The great hall corridor is lit by iron sconces that have not been replaced since the keep was built. The light they give is amber and uneven, the kind that catches the edges of things without fully illuminating them. It catches the broad set of the Alpha King's shoulders, the easy, unexamined certainty of a man in a space that has never once required him to be uncertain. His voice carries the way voices do in stone rooms, further than intended, further than he has bothered to calculate, because he has never needed to calculate it before. He believes the corridor belongs entirely to him. He believes, as he has believed for 7 years, that what he cannot see does not require his consideration. He is wrong. He has been wrong for 4 months. He is about to find out what that costs. Isolde Vane stands 4 steps behind him. She was returning from the eastern wing. She heard voices and slowed without deciding to, because she has learned in 4 months at Stonevale Keep that the truest things Caelan Morrow says are the things he says in rooms he does not believe she is in. She has been collecting these truths the way you collect evidence, carefully, without rushing, with the unhurried attention of a woman who understands that the quality of what you assemble determines the weight of what you can act on. She has been assembling. She has been patient. She has been, for 4 months, the most careful person in this keep. She is 4 steps behind the man who does not know she is there, and she is about to hear the last thing she needed to hear. She was a mistake. The bond was politically necessary. Beyond that, she is nothing the pack needs to concern itself with. The words arrive with the flat, specific weight of a door being locked from the inside. Not cruelty. Cruelty would require acknowledging she exists enough to be worth cruelty. Something worse than that. The casual, unexamined dismissal of a man who has decided, without once examining that decision, that she does not merit the effort of careful language. She stands in the amber light and feels each word land in the specific place it was always going to land. Not her chest, not her throat, but somewhere lower and more permanent. Her hand finds her abdomen without her deciding that either. 6 weeks. She has known for 6 weeks. She has told no one. He does not turn around. She does not speak. The decision she has been holding carefully for 6 weeks, turning it over in the early dark, examining it from every angle, giving it every fair consideration a patient woman gives a thing she does not want to get wrong, solidifies in the space between one breath and the next into something cold and clean and entirely her own. Not anger, not grief, something past both of those. Something that has gone all the way through anger and grief and come out the other side as clarity, the specific, quiet clarity of a woman who has just received the last piece of evidence she needed and understands with complete and final certainty exactly what she is going to do. She turns, she walks back into the dark. The heir to Stonevale Kingdom goes with her. She was not always this still. There was a version of Isolde Vane, the one who existed before Stonevale, before 4 months of systematic erasure dressed up as indifference, who laughed too quickly and asked too many questions and held her opinions without apology in rooms full of people who had not asked for them. Her mother had raised her that way. "You were born with good eyes," her mother used to say, pressing 2 fingers lightly to Isolde's temple as though sealing something in. Learn to use them before you learn to use your voice. The woman who sees everything and reveals nothing is the most powerful person in any room she enters. Her mother had raised her for exactly this. She had not known when she was learning it that she would one day need it this badly. The Vane settlement was not a grand place, no strategic significance, no political weight worth calculating. What it had was tended, the specific, deliberate quality of a home that has been loved carefully over generations rather than built for impression. Stone walls softened by climbing growth, a great fire that was never allowed to go fully cold, a mother who understood that stillness was not silence and patience was not passivity, and who spent 23 years making sure her daughter understood the difference between them. Isolde had left that settlement 4 months ago with 2 traveling chests, her companion Sarah, and the specific, open-eyed faith of a woman who understood the arrangement she was entering and had decided, with full knowledge of what she was deciding, to give it every honest chance she had. She had arrived at Stone Vale Keep expecting not warmth, not romance, but respect. The basic acknowledgement that the role she was filling was real, that the woman filling it was real. She had prepared herself for distance. Caelan Morrow's reputation for cold efficiency had preceded him across 3 territories, and she was not a woman who built expectations on rumors of warmth that had never been promised. She had prepared for the gap between a political arrangement and a genuine partnership, had told herself she was patient enough to build a bridge across it, had believed, with the specific, stubborn faith of someone raised to finish what they start, that patience was always eventually rewarded. She had been wrong about that. She was learning, at great personal cost, the difference between patience and endurance. What she found was Caelan Morrow, 31 years old, Alpha King for 7 years, a man so completely accustomed to managing his world that he no longer noticed what his management cost the things it touched. He was not cruel. That was the specific and uncomfortable truth she had spent 4 months turning over. Cruelty would have required seeing her first. He was something more specific and harder to name. Indifferent in the way of someone who has decided, without examining the decision, that a thing is not worth the effort of attention. He managed his pack with precision. He managed his alliances with intelligence. He managed Isolde the way he managed everything else, from a distance, with the minimum necessary attention, and called it sufficient. It was not sufficient. It had never been sufficient. There was one thing, though, one crack in the efficiency she had been cataloging. She had noticed it twice. The first time was in the 3rd week, when she had entered the strategy room unexpectedly and found him standing at the window with a document in his hand and an expression on his face that had nothing managed about it. He had heard her footstep, and the expression was gone before he turned, filed, contained, managed back into the flat authority of a king who did not have private faces. But she had seen it. 1 second of something unguarded, something that looked, from the distance of 3 feet, like exhaustion so deep it had moved past feeling into something structural. She had filed it carefully. She had not known then what to do with it. She was beginning now to understand. The Pack Council session 3 weeks after her arrival. She had come prepared, with observations about the bond line tension she had been quietly tracking in the northern quadrant. Data no one had asked her to collect. Data no one knew she had. She had spent 4 days assembling it carefully, the way she assembled everything. Caelan had begun the meeting without acknowledging her presence. Not a glance. Not the small, perfunctory acknowledgement a Luna was owed by every protocol the pack observed. Nothing. She had spoken anyway, laid out her findings without apology, without the performed hesitation that might have made it easier for him to receive. The elder wolves had listened. She had felt their attention shift. Caelan had responded to her words without once looking at her, as though her voice had arrived from the ceiling. Oversight, she had told herself. He did not mean it. She had filed it anyway. The formal dinner in the 2nd month. seated at the table's edge, 3 hours without a single comment directed toward her. She had been invisible in the way of furniture that has been in a room so long no one registers it anymore. She had eaten her dinner and kept her face composed and added it to the file. The morning she brought him intelligence about the eastern border tension, specific, evidenced, accurate. 2 days later, she had stood in the corridor outside the strategy room and listened to him present the same intelligence to his lieutenants, with the flat certainty of a man delivering his own conclusions. He had not looked up when she passed the open door. She had not stopped walking. The file was growing. The evidence was becoming, with the accumulation of weeks, impossible to interpret as anything other than what it was. And then, Bram. She had not planned it. She had been returning from the library in the deep hours of a Thursday night, the keep dark around her, when she heard it through the wall of the eastern wing. A girl crying. Not performed crying, the small, exhausted, private crying of someone who believed they were alone and had been holding it too long. She had stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, exactly the amount of time it took to understand she was not going to walk past it. The girl was 17, Bram's younger sister. A fever climbing toward dangerous with the specific, quiet urgency of something that does not announce its intentions until it is too late to argue with them. Isolde had fetched the healer without ceremony, without waking the household. She had sat down beside the girl and taken her hand. She had stayed through the worst hours, her eyes on the healer's face, reading every micro-expression for information the healer was not saying aloud. Her hand around the girl's hand, steady and warm, and entirely present in the way she had not been permitted to be present in any official capacity in this keep for 4 months. The fever had broken at dawn, slow, then sudden, the way fevers break, like a held breath released. The healer had exhaled. The girl's grip had loosened. Isolde had stayed 10 minutes more until she was certain, and then she had slipped out before the household woke. She had not done it to be seen. She had done it because she heard a sound through a wall she was not capable of walking past, and because she is, despite 4 months of being told otherwise, not nothing. Bram had found her in the corridor 2 hours later, 19 years old, broad-shouldered, with the specific expression of someone carrying a weight they do not have words for. He had looked at her, just looked, for a long moment, and she had understood everything in that look. The gratitude, the helplessness of it, the particular anguish of owing someone something that cannot be repaid in any currency that exists. She had nodded once and walked on. She had not stopped thinking about his face since. It was the face she held on to when the file of evidence grew too heavy. It was the reason she knew, when the time came, that leaving would not be abandonment. She was not leaving the pack. She was protecting the most important thing the pack had. She had just not yet decided whether she was the only one who understood that. 6 weeks ago, on a gray Tuesday morning, when Caelan had already been gone from their shared chamber for 2 hours without waking her to say where, she had taken the testing materials she had carried from home in the bottom of her travel chest. She had done the test alone. The result had arrived with the specific, quiet devastation of something you already knew being confirmed in a language too precise to argue with. She had sat with it in the thin, early light for a very long time, not crying, not performing grief for an audience of no one, simply sitting with the full weight of what she now understood, that she was carrying something irreplaceable inside a situation she no longer trusted to protect it. Some knowledge changes everything immediately. Some changes everything slowly. This one had done both, simultaneously, in the gray light of a Tuesday morning she would never be able to unknow. She had told no one. She had gone to the pack's official healer twice since, for unrelated complaints, and had each time navigated the examination with the specific, careful competence of a woman who knows exactly which questions to answer and which to redirect. She had filed a preliminary examination under a false name, had a settlement healer half a day's ride from the keep, a woman her mother had known, a woman who accepted gold and silence and asked nothing else. She had believed it safe. She had told herself it was safe. But there were moments, during dinners, during council sessions, during the long nights when Caelan had already left their shared chamber before she woke, when she would feel the keep's bond-sensitive air around her and understand that 3 weeks was a generous estimate. She had been deciding faster than she had been admitting. The first time it happened in front of witnesses, Isolde told herself it was oversight. The second time, she stopped using the word. The Eastern delegate arrived on a Wednesday, young, sharp-eyed, with the particular attentiveness of someone who had been carefully briefed before crossing a border. He had addressed her with the full title of Luna, every syllable of the respect her role was owed, and then he had asked her opinion, not as courtesy, as genuine inquiry, leaning forward, his full attention on her face, waiting with the specific quality of someone who expected her answer to be worth hearing. She had answered, clearly, specifically. The delegate had nodded, made a note, and said, "That is more useful than anything I have heard in 2 days of formal sessions, my Luna." She had felt, for the first time in 4 months, like a person. Across the table, Caelan, jaw tight, eyes moving between the delegate and Isolde with the unreadable expression of a man who cannot name what is bothering him because naming it would require examining it. He had not said a word. Beside her, 3 seats down, Sarah, always watching from the precise distance of someone who has learned that observation is the only form of loyalty that does not cost the person you love something they cannot afford. Sarah, who had noticed 3 weeks ago the way Isolde's hand moved sometimes to her abdomen, who had noticed the wine declined every dinner. The northern vintage disagrees with me, I find, delivered without hesitation because Isolde had been rehearsing it for 5 weeks, who had said nothing, who was waiting with the patience of a woman who trusted that the right moment would announce itself, who was beginning to understand that the moment was very close. There was a third incident. The great hall gathering 2 evenings before the corridor. Caelan's voice carrying just far enough. The bond ceremony was a political necessity. I expect the arrangement to be managed with as little disruption to pack operations as possible, said to Harlan, said while she stood 3 tables away, said with the ease of a man who has never once calculated the reach of his own voice because he has never needed to. She had not moved, had not changed her expression, had lifted her cup and taken a measured sip and filed it. But something had shifted in the filing this time. She was no longer assembling evidence toward a decision. She had the decision. She was assembling evidence toward courage. And courage, she was discovering, arrived not in one dramatic wave, but in the accumulation of everything you could no longer pretend you had not seen. That same evening, Harlan found Caelan alone in the strategy room. She did not witness this. She would never know it happened. Harlan Voss, senior lieutenant, 7 years of loyal service, a man who chose his words with the care of someone who understood what the wrong ones could cost, had closed the door and stood at the measured distance of a man about to say something true. "She is more capable than you are using her, my king." Not an accusation, a careful observation, delivered by a man who had been holding it for weeks and had finally calculated that the cost of saying it was lower than the cost of silence. The elder wolves have noticed, the Eastern delegation noticed, it may be worth your attention. The room had been very quiet. Caelan had looked up from the document in his hand. He had looked at Harlan for one long moment, and something had moved through him that he would not examine until he was on a road 3 days north with nothing left to manage. Not dismissal. Something more complicated than dismissal, something that arrived in his chest with a specific, uncomfortable quality of information that does not fit the category already assigned to it. He had held it for exactly 3 seconds. And then, not from cruelty, not from certainty, but from the specific cowardice of a man who has built his entire identity on competence and cannot afford to be wrong about something this visible for this long, he had filed it. She is fulfilling her function. 3 seconds. That was how long it had taken him to choose the locked door over the open one. Harlan had nodded, changed the subject. His face had not changed, but he had walked out of that room knowing something had just been decided, and not in the right direction. She heard every word. That is the thing she will carry longest, not the words themselves, which she had been assembling toward for 4 months, but the specific quality of his voice when he said them, the ease of it, the complete, unexamined ease of a man speaking in a room he believes belongs entirely to him. She had stood in the amber light and felt each word land with the flat weight of a door locked from the inside. She had looked at Harlan. He had not looked back, but she had seen it anyway. The almost imperceptible shift in his jaw, the micro-expression of a man who did not want to be standing in this corridor for this conversation. His eyes had stayed forward. His face had stayed composed. He said nothing, because there was nothing, in that moment, that a careful man could say. The damage was already done. She had turned. She had walked back into the dark. Her chambers were quiet. Sarah was asleep, curled on her side with the complete unconsciousness of someone who had learned to take rest when it was available. Isolde did not wake her. She crossed to the window and sat on the cold stone sill and looked out at the northern territory spreading dark and vast beyond the keep's walls. And then she let herself feel it. All of it. Not managed, not filed, not compressed into evidence and held at careful distance. She went all the way to the bottom of it. The 4 months, the file, the elder meetings, the formal dinners, the morning her own intelligence had been delivered back to her without attribution. Bran's face, the gray Tuesday morning, the test she had done alone. She went all the way down, and she stayed there until the hollow it left was clean. Then she began to think. She was not an impulsive woman. She had never made a decision of consequence from the bottom of an emotion, not because she did not feel things, but because she understood that grief was not a planning state, and the quality of the thinking determined the quality of the outcome. She waited until she was past it, until what remained was not feeling, but clarity, cold and specific and entirely hers. Her resources. Modest but real. The Vane settlement accounts her mother had insisted remain in her name regardless of the bond arrangement. A quiet insistence Isolde had accepted without fully understanding why until this exact moment. Her mother had known the shape of what could happen to a woman who arrived at a powerful man's house with nothing that belonged only to her. She had made sure her daughter would not be that woman. Her mother's connections in the northern settlements, Relationships predating Stonevale's reach, built over decades by a woman who understood that the most valuable alliances were the ones no one thought to map. 3 weeks, possibly less, before the pregnancy became impossible to conceal from people with bond-sensitive instincts. The healer's note, filed under a false name. She had believed it safe. She pushed that thought down. She could not afford it yet. Sarah, whose loyalty she did not have to question, not because she had tested it, but because 23 years of shared history was its own form of evidence, and Isolde trusted evidence above everything. She went through it all twice, found no gaps she could not account for, found no contingency she had not already assigned. Then she pressed her hand flat against her abdomen and made the promise she had been building toward for 6 weeks. I know what you are. I will not give you to someone who doesn't. She woke Sarah before dawn. The room was still gray-dark, the hour when the keep was quietest and the border wolves were changing rotation. Sarah came awake the way she always did, immediately, fully, with the eyes of someone who had spent years understanding that Isolde did not wake her for small things. She looked at Isolde's face. She looked once, briefly, with the attention of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment, at her abdomen. She did not ask how long she had known. She did not ask why now. She did not perform the grief or the fear or the outrage that another woman might have performed, because Sarah understood that Isolde had already carried all of those things alone, and what she needed now was not more feeling. She needed a witness to the decision. When do we leave? 2 days, Isolde said. One last thing first. She also thought about Bram. Not to reconsider. She was done reconsidering, done with the entire architecture of hesitation that had kept her here 4 months past the point when a less patient woman would have left. She thought about his face in the corridor after his sister's fever broke, the weight in it, the specific, inarticulate gratitude of someone who understood they owed something they would never have language for. She thought about his sister, who would grow up. She thought about the child in her body, who would one day stand where Caelan stood, who would one day lead the pack Bram belonged to, and she understood with complete, clean clarity that she was not abandoning Stonevale. She was protecting the most important thing it had. The heir would return one day. It would return knowing its worth. That was not abandonment. That was the only responsible thing she could do. What she did not know, sitting in that window with her plan assembled and her grief finished, was that 3 corridors away, in the keep's administrative wing, a door was opening. The head healer, lamp in hand, moving through the pre-dawn dark toward his private records room with the purpose of a man who has just remembered something he should have checked weeks ago. A name that had come back to him tonight, in a dream or something close enough to a dream, attached to a face he knew very well. A preliminary examination note, filed 6 weeks ago under a name that had not, at the time, triggered anything in him. He had been tired that day. He had filed it without reading it closely. He had been thinking about it in the drifting way of unfinished things for 2 weeks. His hand found the cabinet. His lamp illuminated the file. He stood very still for a long time. She wore amber. Not the quiet, accommodating neutrals she had been choosing for 4 months, the colors of a woman making herself easy to overlook, which she had told herself was strategy, and which she now understood had also been hope. She was done with that hope. She dressed in the colors of the Vane line, deep amber and old gold, the colors her mother had wrapped her in since childhood, the colors that said, "I come from something real and I have not forgotten it." She braided her copper hair back from her face with the specific, unhurried care of a woman performing a ritual she is performing for the last time. She looked at herself in the bronze mirror for one full moment. She looked like herself. She had not looked like herself in 4 months. She found she had missed the sight more than she had been allowing herself to admit. The room shifted when she entered the great hall. Not dramatically, not the obvious shift of a crowd responding to an entrance. Something subtler and more significant. The pack's collective attention catching on something different about her, without being able to name it. The way you register a change in air pressure before you understand a storm is coming. Conversations continued, eyes moved, something recalibrated across the room in the quiet, distributed way of a pack whose instincts were registering information their king had not yet processed. Harlan saw her first. She watched him see her, watched the specific quality of attention that moved across his face, the expression of a man who has been assembling a private verdict for weeks and has just received the piece of evidence that confirms it entirely. He did not smile, he did not nod, he simply looked at her with the settled clarity of someone who understands now exactly how this ends. The Eastern delegate rose slightly from his chair when she passed. A small gesture. A real one. Caelan did not look up until she was already seated. She had expected that. She had stopped building expectations around anything else. She ate her dinner and she watched, differently than she had watched for 4 months, without the filter of hoping she was wrong. She saw everything she had been half-seeing, assembled now into complete and unambiguous clarity. The elder wolf at the table's far end, whose eyes moved to her with the attention of someone who had been paying quiet notice for weeks. The lieutenant 2 seeks from Caelan, whose jaw tightened when Caelan spoke over something she said. Not Harlan's resigned stillness, something younger and less controlled, the anger of a man who has not yet learned to fully contain his private assessments. Caelan's inner circle was not unanimous. It had not been unanimous for some time. Then she saw Bram. He was standing near the service entrance on the hall's far side, not supposed to be here at this hour, here anyway. Standing with the careful stillness of someone who had positioned himself somewhere he could see her without being seen doing it. He was here because she was here. He did not know it was the last time. She held his gaze across the length of the hall and gave him the small nod, the same one she had given him in the corridor after his sister's fever broke, the one that said, "I see you. You do not owe me anything. You are enough." He straightened. His shoulders came back. Something moved through him that she recognized, the specific quality of a person receiving permission to stand at their full height. She looked away. It was enough. It was exactly enough. She finished her dinner. She answered when spoken to. She performed, one final time, the composed and graceful presence of a Luna who had spent 4 months giving this keep more than it had the dignity to accept. She gave nothing away. She set down her fork. She folded her napkin. She rose with the quiet, unhurried composure of a woman who has already left, whose body is simply the last part of her to go. She did not look at Caelan. She walked out of the great hall of Stonevale Keep for the last time. What she did not know, moving through the stone corridors toward her chambers, was that the head healer had been at the dinner, had sat at the table's far end with his coat still on and his food untouched, watching the way she moved, watching the way she held herself. He had looked once at the Alpha King. He had made a decision. She rode out in the gray hour before full dawn, 2 horses, packed light, only what was necessary, only what could not be left behind. Sarah rode beside her without speaking. The route north was not the main territory road. It was older, a trading path from before Stonevale's reach had extended this far, marked by nothing visible to anyone who had not been told where to look. Her mother's connections included a man who remembered the old roads. She had written to him 6 weeks ago. She had been planning for longer than she had been admitting to herself. She had left 2 letters on the chamber table. The first was for the Pack Council, formal, precise, invoking the Luna's sovereign right of withdrawal under the old Pack covenants with the relevant covenant page folded inside the envelope because she had spent 2 evenings in the lower library confirming it still applied. The second letter was for Caelan. 3 sentences. No explanation. She did not owe him one. And more than that, she understood with the clean clarity of a woman who has thought this all the way through that explanation would be a form of asking. She was not asking. She was not negotiating. She was exercising the only leverage she had ever truly held, which was the choice to go. The border wolf was young. He knew her face. He saw 2 women on horses in the pre-dawn gray, and he saw the Luna's composed face, and he did not ask questions, because the specific quality of her composure had never once invited questions, and no one had told him to stop her. He filed his morning report at first light. It reached the keep's head of border security 2 hours after that. It reached the council room 3 hours after that. By then, she was already deep in the Northern Territory. Caelan felt it before the report arrived. He had been mid-sentence addressing the council on the Eastern Territory water rights dispute when it happened. A break. Not audible, not visible, something internal and completely unprecedented. The particular quality of presence he had been managing from a distance for 4 months, registering its absence with the sudden, disorienting clarity of a sound a room has been making so long you stopped hearing it until the moment it stops. He had stopped mid-sentence. The council room had gone very still. His lieutenant's hand appeared at the edge of his vision, a folded report, extended with the careful, expressionless delivery of someone who understood they were handing their king something he was not going to want to hold. He read it once. He read it again. 7 faces arranged in the stillness of people who understand something significant is happening and have not yet determined whether they are permitted to react. The session is adjourned. He walked out. The corridor was amber-lit, the same iron sconces, the same worn stone floors, the same corridor where he had stood 4 days ago, with the easy certainty of a man in a room that belonged entirely to him. He stopped in the middle of it. He stood very still for a long moment, and something happened in Caelan Morrow's chest that had not happened in 7 years of being Alpha King. Something without a name in the vocabulary of a man who had spent 7 years ensuring he would not need one. Something that cut through management and calculation and landed somewhere undefended. He stood in it. He did not try to file it. He was discovering for the first time that some things could not be filed, that some absences were too precisely shaped to be anything other than what they were. The corridor was empty. It had never felt empty before. Their shared chamber smelled of something he could not name. He had been in this room every night for 4 months and had not noticed the specific quality of it until the moment it was the only thing left. He stood in the center of it and understood that the smell was not perfume, was not her things, which were gone, the travel chest, the braiding cord, the small clay figure from the Vane settlement that had sat on the windowsill. He had never once asked about that figure. He understood now, standing in its absence, that he had never asked about anything. It was simply her. 4 months of her, pressed into the stone walls, present, quiet, persistent, and entirely, irrevocably gone. The letter was on the table. 3 sentences. He read them 4 times, not because they were unclear, because clarity was not the same as comprehension, and he was, for the first time in 7 years, struggling to comprehend. He set the letter down. He picked it up again. He thought about the smell of the room, the clay figure, the wine she had declined. The northern vintage disagrees with me. Every dinner for weeks, with the smooth alternative excuse of a woman who had been rehearsing it long enough that it had stopped sounding rehearsed. He thought about her hand moving to her abdomen. He thought about how many times he had seen that and filed it as nothing, because he had been filing everything about her as nothing, efficiently, without examination, for 4 months. He thought about her face across the formal table, not with hope, not with anger, but with the clean, final clarity of someone looking at something for the last time. He had not known it was the last time. He had not been paying the kind of attention that would have told him. He knew now. The knowing had a specific physical weight. He walked to the courtyard. His fastest horse was already being saddled. Harlan, anticipating by 20 minutes, giving the order quietly without being asked, the way Harlan did everything. He called for his horse. He rode. Harlan stood at the council room window and watched the courtyard empty and said nothing. He was thinking about a strategy room 3 weeks ago, a careful, respectful observation delivered to a man who had received it and filed it and moved on in under 3 seconds. She is more capable than you are using her, my king. He was thinking about how different the calculation would be. He did not reach for his coat. Some things a man had to ride toward himself. Some doors only opened from the inside. The man riding north had just decided to open one. Whether he reached it in time was another question entirely. Harlan had his own opinion about that. He kept it to himself. Harlan turned from the window. He went still. The head healer was standing in the council room doorway, coat on, face composed with the deliberate composure of a man controlling something significant. He had a folded document in his hand. He looked at Harlan with the expression of someone who has arrived with information and is calculating, in real time, who now needs to receive it. "He has already gone," Harlan said. "I know," said the healer. A silence. The kind that has weight. "Then you need to understand," the healer said carefully, "exactly what he is riding after." He held out the document. Harlan took it. He read it once. He did not read it again. He did not need to. He stood very still, with the paper in his hands, and an expression on his face that the council wolves present would never be able to fully describe afterward. The room was very, very still. He rode alone. No escort, no inner circle, no formation of lieutenants who would translate his urgency into protocol, and his fear — he was beginning on this road to understand that fear was the correct word — into something that looked like leadership. Just his fastest horse, and the 3-sentence letter in his riding coat, and the specific, unprecedented feeling of a man who has run completely out of managed distance. The territory roads fell behind him. Pre-dawn dark gave way to gray, gave way to the thin, cold light of a northern morning that offered visibility without warmth. He rode through it, and he thought. Not in the clean, organized way he thought through political problems, not with the efficient linearity of a man assembling a strategy, but in the involuntary, accumulating way of someone whose mind has stopped accepting instruction and started, for the first time, simply accounting. The Eastern delegate, leaning forward across the formal table, "That is more useful than anything I have heard in 2 days of sessions, my Luna." The quality of her face when she received it. Not relief, not gratitude, but the quiet steadiness of someone accepting what was always owed. He had watched that exchange with a tight jaw and had not examined why. He was examining it now. The pack elder meeting. Her voice arriving from no particular direction because he had not looked at her when she spoke. He had filed the elder's recalibrating attention as routine and moved to the next item, and she had let him, because she had the specific and terrible patience of a woman who had decided to give something every fair chance before she stopped giving it. He had spent 4 months inside that patience and had not once understood it for what it was. He was understanding it now. He thought about the wine she had declined. Every dinner. Weeks of it. The smooth alternative excuse he had not once questioned, because he had not been paying the kind of attention that would have made it a question. He thought about her hand moving to her abdomen. He had seen it. He had registered it, filed it, moved on. He had been filing everything about her with the efficient negligence of a man who had decided the category before he examined the contents. He thought about the clay figure on the windowsill. He had walked past it every morning for 4 months. He had never asked about it. He was understanding now, on this road, what asking might have cost him. Not in effort, not in time, but in the specific vulnerability of a man who admits that something in his space matters to him. He had not been willing to pay that cost. He was beginning to understand what it had cost him instead. The first settlement appeared at mid-morning, a small cluster of stone buildings around a central well. A woman was drawing water, young, wolf-born, with a child on her hip and the assessing eyes of someone who had spent her life reading approaching strangers before they arrived. She recognized him. He saw the recognition and watched her choose, deliberately, not to perform the automatic deference his title commanded. She looked at him with private judgment, with the specific quality of someone deciding how much this person deserves from them. "You are riding fast, my king," she said. He pulled up. He did not know why, except that something in her steadiness felt like information he needed, like a mirror held at an angle he had not seen himself from before. "I am looking for someone," he said. "The Luna. She left this morning." He stopped. He tried again. "I am going to find her." The woman looked at him for a long moment. The child on her hip reached for something invisible and was gently redirected. The well rope swayed. "Is she well?" The question landed somewhere undefended, because the answer was that he did not know, that he had not known for 4 months, because he had not asked, had not looked, had managed her from a distance and called it sufficient, and it had not been sufficient. It had been the specific and inexcusable negligence of a man who confused presence with attention and attention with care. 3 different things. He had never once understood them as 3 different things until this exact moment, standing at a well in a settlement that did not appear on any map he had been given, being asked by a woman who owed him nothing whether the Luna was well. "I am going to find out," he said. She held his gaze 1 beat longer than deference required. "Good," she said, and turned back to her water. He rowed. The bond lines were thin, thinner than he had known a pack bond could be while still technically intact. The specific physical sensation of an emotional fabric pulled to its outermost limit. A warmth that had been diffuse and constant and entirely unnoticed for 4 months, now concentrated into a single directional pull. Like a compass finding north. She was there. She was moving. She was alive, and she was moving, and the bond he had been managing from a distance, efficiently, with the minimum necessary attention, treating it as a variable to be maintained rather than a living connection between two people, was telling him something it had probably been trying to tell him for months. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. The thing he had called nothing was the only thing in 4 months that had been genuinely, fully, irreplaceably real. The merchant was at the crossroads an hour north, a broad, weathered wolf with the particular stillness of a man who has been on territory roads long enough to know that not everything approaching from the south deserves an immediate answer. He looked at Caelan with the long, assessing look of someone deciding how much this king deserved to know. Not hostility, something more unsettling. The measuring look of a man with his own information and his own criteria, applying both before he speaks. "Luna rode through here," the merchant said finally, "before dawn. 2 women, packed light." A deliberate pause. "Rode well." "Which way?" Another pause. Longer. The merchant's eyes moving across Caelan's face with the unhurried attention of someone reading something they want to be sure they have read correctly. "North," he said. "Fast." He did not add anything. He did not need to. The pause had been the rest of the message. Caelan rode north. He did not know what the healer's document said. He did not know that Harlan was standing in the council room with a piece of paper in his hands and an expression the council wolves had never seen there before. He did not know that 2 riders had already been dispatched north, one an hour ago, one 20 minutes ago, both faster than casual, neither yet fast enough to close the distance. He only knew the pull of the bond lines and the cold morning air and the particular, desperate arithmetic of a man trying to cover in hours the distance that 4 months of not looking had put between him and the only thing that had ever mattered. He rode harder than he had ridden anything. And 3 days north, in a healer's cottage in a small stone settlement, Isolde Vane sat by a window with her hand on her abdomen and felt, faintly, at the very edge of perception, something coming. She knew he was coming an hour before he arrived. The settlement's border wolf had sent word, brief, factual: "The Alpha King rides north, alone, hard." She had read the note once, set it on the table, and spent the hour that followed doing something she had not done since the corridor. She sat with it. All of it. The full weight of what was about to walk through that door. She thought, in that hour, about the child, not the heir, not the political calculation, not the succession weight, the child, the specific, unfinished person growing in her body who did not yet know what kind of world it was being born into. She pressed her hand flat against her abdomen, and she thought, "You will know your worth. From the first day, from the first breath, whatever it costs me, you will never have to assemble evidence about whether you are real." That was the promise. That was what she was protecting. Not herself. She had made peace with the cost of this before she rode out at dawn. The child. The specific, irreplaceable, not yet born person who deserved a world built on something more honest than the one its father had been running. She was still holding that thought when Sarah answered the door. She heard the knock from the table where she sat. She heard Sarah's footsteps, unhurried, deliberate. She heard the door open. She heard the silence that followed, which was the silence of Sarah looking at a man with 3 days of hard riding on him, and something in his expression she had never seen there before, and making a decision. She heard Sarah step aside. She did not stand. She had decided, in the hour of waiting, that she would not stand. not from hostility, but because she was done performing deference to a man who had never once extended her the same. He stopped in the doorway. Something moved across his face, not the controlled, managed expression she had watched for 4 months, something that had no management over it. The specific, unguarded experience of a man looking at something he dismissed and understanding, in the looking, the full and irreversible dimension of what he had actually been seeing all along. She let him look. She did not make it easier for him. She did not soften her composure or adjust her expression to manage his discomfort, because she had spent 4 months managing everyone's discomfort in this arrangement, and she was done with that. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight in her Vane house colors, and she looked at him with the specific, steady clarity of a woman who has already decided and is simply waiting for the conversation to confirm it. The fire shifted, the medicinal smell of the cottage, the cold northern dark pressing against the window. You heard me. Not a question. 3 days of road had stripped him of questions. Yes, she said. The silence between them had weight. 4 months of it, compressed into the space between two people who had never once, in all that time, spoken to each other honestly. He did not fill it. She noticed that. He stood in it and held it and did not reach for the efficiency that had always been his first response to discomfort. He was learning, on his feet, in real time, what it felt like to be present in a silence without managing it. You are carrying my air. His eyes had moved, briefly, once, to her hands in her lap, to the way she was sitting, to the thing he should have seen 6 weeks ago. She held the power of it for one long moment, the knowledge she had carried alone through every room he had not once looked at her in. Yes, she said. The silence that followed was different from the first. Fuller. The specific fullness of something irreversible being named between two people for the first time. He crossed to the table, did not reach for the chair, did not perform anything. He stood across from her with 3 days of hard road on him and no prepared language left, and he looked like what he was, a man standing in the open for the first time, finding it harder than he expected, doing it anyway. I was wrong. Not a preamble. 3 words stated with the flat plainness of a man who understands the difference between true and false and has finally, at great personal cost, stopped operating in the wrong column. She received it. She held it without rushing. Then, and this was the part she had not planned, the part that arrived without her deciding, her voice came out slightly unsteady on the next words. Not broken, but not controlled either. Human. I know, she said. And her voice steadied after the first word, but not before he heard it. The crack, the fraction of a second where 4 months of assembled composure showed its seam. That is not why I left. He held very still. She could see him holding still, see him register what he had just heard in her voice, and choose, deliberately, not to use it, not to manage it, not to file it, to simply receive it and stay in it with her. That was the second thing he had done right since he walked through the door. She continued. I left because I will not raise this child in a keep where its mother is nothing. I will not let the first lesson this heir learns be that the person who carried it was a mistake. Level voice. Steady hands. You do not get to understand my worth the moment I demonstrate I will leave without that being the entire story. He held her gaze. He did not argue. He did not reach for the defense, the efficiency argument, the political framing, the managed language of a king explaining his decisions. She could see him not reaching for it, could see the specific, visible effort of a man who has spent 7 years defaulting to management, choosing, in real time, to do something else instead. Something moved across his face, a flicker, barely perceptible, of the instinct toward control. He felt it arrive, she watched him feel it arrive, and then she watched him, for the first time, set it down. Not file it, set it down. The distinction was the entire distance between who he had been 4 months ago and who he was trying, on his feet, in a healer's cottage in the northern settlements, to become. "What do you need?" he asked. His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it, not softer, quieter. There was a difference. She looked at him, the father of her child, the Alpha King whose territory the air in her body would one day lead, the man who had called her nothing 4 days ago, and was now standing in a cottage with nothing left to manage her with. "Time," she said. "On my terms, in my conditions. Not at Stonevale. Not yet, and possibly not ever. You will not manage this the way you manage everything else. You will not optimize it. You will not make it efficient." The fire shifted behind her. "You will earn it. One day at a time, with nothing required of me until I decide to give it." A long silence, the longest yet. She watched him hold it, watched him resist the instinct to fill it with reassurance or planning or the forward momentum of a man who processes things by moving through them. He held the silence. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. She held his answer. It was not enough. She was not going to tell him it was enough, because a beginning was not a resolution, and she knew the difference. But it was a beginning, the first honest exchange in 4 months, the first moment where the Alpha King was not the only person standing in his own skin. She looked at Sarah, who gave her nothing, whose eyes said clearly, "Your call, entirely yours." She looked back at Caelan. "Sit down," she said. "We have a great deal to discuss." He sat. Not after a pause, not after a performance of consideration. He simply sat, with the specific, unornamented compliance of a man who has run out of ways to be in charge of this situation and has accepted that this is correct. Sarah moved to the fire. The cottage settled into the specific quiet of a space where something important is beginning. Outside, the northern dark pressed cold against the windows. 3 days south, Harlon Voss stood at the council room window with the healer's document still in his hand. He had read it 4 times. He had sent 2 riders north, neither yet close enough to matter. He stood very still and thought about a strategy room 3 weeks ago, a careful truth delivered to a man who had received it and filed it in under 3 seconds. "She is more capable than you are using her, my king." He thought about how different the calculation would be. He thought about the document in his hands, which changed the calculation entirely, which meant that what was happening in that cottage 3 days north was not only a personal reckoning between a king and the woman he had dismissed, it was the most significant political moment in Stonevale's history since Caelan's coronation. And it was happening in a healer's cottage, by firelight, on her terms, as it should be. Somewhere in Stonevale Keep's eastern wing, a 19-year-old packmate was going about his evening duties. He did not yet know the Luna had gone. He did not yet know what was being decided 3 days north by firelight. He knew only what he had always known, that there was a woman in this keep who had sat through the worst night with his sister and slipped out before dawn and never asked for a word of thanks. He had been watching for her the past 2 days with the specific attention of someone who has something they need to say and has not yet found the courage to say it. He had not seen her at dinner. He had not seen her in the corridors. He was beginning, with the instinct of a young wolf whose bond-sensitive awareness was more developed than he had been given credit for, to understand that something had shifted in the keep's emotional fabric. He would find out by morning. He would stand in the corridor outside her empty chambers, with the door open and the carefully smoothed bed visible from the threshold, and understand, with the specific, wordless comprehension of someone whose body knows things before his mind has language for them, that she was gone. He would stand there for a long time. He would not cry, not because he was not feeling it, but because the feeling was too large and too specific for tears, which belonged to a different category of loss. This was something else. This was the specific grief of someone who has been given something irreplaceable without being told it was irreplaceable, and now understood both facts simultaneously. He would stand in that corridor for a long time, and then he would straighten, the same straightening she had given him permission for across the dinner hall, and go back to his duties. He would wait. Back in the cottage, the conversation had moved past the first exchange into something harder and more specific, not warmer. Warmth was not the right word for what was happening between them, and Isolde was not interested in warmth as a destination. Honest was the word. They were being, for the first time, honest, with the specific, grinding difficulty of two people who have spent 4 months in the same space communicating nothing real, now attempting to communicate something that matters, without any of the practiced ease that trust, built over time, would have given them. It was hard. She had expected it to be hard. What she had not expected was how clearly she could see him working, could see him choosing, repeatedly, in real time, to stay in the discomfort rather than manage his way out of it. She was keeping count. She was not telling him she was keeping count. He asked, at one point, about the clay figure, the one from the Vane settlement. The one that had sat on the windowsill for 4 months, and that he had never once asked about. He asked about it quietly, without preamble, not as a strategy, not as a gesture toward warmth, but with the specific, halting quality of a man learning, on his feet, that the way you begin to know a person is by asking about the things they brought with them. She told him. Her grandmother had made it. The clay was from the Vane settlement's eastern riverbank, a particular clay, reddish and dense, that her grandmother had used for everything she made with her hands. She had brought the figure because it was the thing in her childhood home she had reached for most consistently when she needed to remember what solid felt like. She told him this plainly. She watched him receive it without filing it. She took note. The fire burned lower. Sarah refueled it without being asked, the quiet, unobtrusive competence of a woman who has spent 23 years making sure the people she loves have what they need without making a performance of the giving. The cottage settled into the specific, weighted quiet of a space where something is being built, not quickly, not without cost, but with the specific, careful attention that the only things worth building require. Isolde was not forgiving him. She had been clear about that in the conversation's earlier exchange, and she remained clear about it now. Not because she was punishing him, but because forgiveness was a thing that had to be built, the way everything real had to be built, from specific and honest materials over sufficient time. What she was doing was something earlier than forgiveness. She was deciding whether the materials were there. She was, with the unhurried attention her mother had given her, beginning to look. Outside the cottage, the northern dark was cold and complete, and entirely indifferent to what was happening inside. The moon-petal flowers along the settlement's eastern wall were fully open, pale gold, quiet, giving their best to the hours when no one was watching. The kind of thing that bloomed without audience. The kind of thing that did not require being seen to be real. Harlan set the document on the windowsill. He looked out at the empty courtyard for a long time. "Don't waste it," he said quietly. To the dark, to the king who could not hear him. This time, don't waste it. The heir to Stonevale Kingdom was not yet born, not yet named, not yet anything except the most important thing that had ever happened in this kingdom, growing quietly in the body of the only person who had ever understood what it was worth. It would be born into a world its mother was already, one honest conversation at a time, rebuilding.